So I'm really into arcade sticks, and the one that's been suiting me really well for the last 10 years or so has been the Seimitsu LS32. In the past few years, I've been noticing that I feel like my abilities are kind of exceeding the limitations of the joystick. In particular, the engage and throw and just the overall tightness of the feel of it. I even did a previous video where I tried things like modifying the actuator to make it a little larger and therefore make the engage shorter and the throw shorter. That didn't really work. So it still bugged me, and I wanted to look around for alternatives. And looking around, it was pretty clear that the LS32 is more or less the most popular joystick for shmups, at least. I should just say right now, I'm sticking with Seimitsu because, I'm so used to it right now that I don't really need to get something that's wildly different. I just wanted something that was like the LS32, but sort of handled these precision issues that I was dealing with. So probably the next in line in terms of popularity is the LS56. But to me, this was kind of a no-go right off the bat because it's basically a taller shaft stick. I don't know if it's meant for players with larger hands or really what. I don't know why you'd want a larger shaft, particularly with shmups. Maybe fighting games it makes more sense. But for me, when you make the shaft higher, you make the throw larger, and then you have to compensate that by making the spring tighter so that it doesn't feel so loose. And a tighter spring is kind of like a makeshift way of solving a problem that shouldn't exist in the first place. So anyways, for me, I know it's not a joystick for me. Maybe it is for other people, but so I didn't go that path. There are some variations on these stick designs, and I've basically found that the LS60 is sort of like maybe a little tighter version of the LS56, whereas the LS40 is supposed to be kind of a tighter version than the LS32, at least spec-wise when you see it on paper. When you look at the specs, the stuff that really jumps out is the shorter throw and engage distance, and the tension not being too high. These are all really good for shmups in my opinion because you basically want to be able to make really quick small adjustments without requiring too much force, and you want them to be really precise and as quick as possible, or else it could feel really laggy and just a lack of precision. One of the first things I had to consider was how to handle the shaft height. I did a previous video where I talked about shaft heights and modifying it to make it as perfect as possible for each individual. And for me, I kind of have a sweet spot that the LS32 just naturally achieves, which is about 22 millimeters. In the LS40, by contrast, if you use the flat SE plate, you get a maximum shaft height of 19.8, but if you use the SS plate, that's sort of S-designed shape plate, then you exceed what my sweet spot is, above 22 millimeters, 24.4 millimeters or so. So with my mod, this isn't a really big deal. I can use the flat plate and experiment with the mod to get a millimeter or so to get it closer to how I like it on the LS32. So looking at the parts, they look really well designed. You can tell pretty much right away. Everything is very solid. There's one thing worth noting about microswitches. Apparently, Seimitsu changed the microswitches in some of their joysticks, the LS32 in particular, which the LS40 is sort of modified design of, so it used the same microswitches as the LS32. People generally didn't like this. This change occurred in the last few years, but my LS32, it's like I said, it was 10 years ago that I got this thing, so I made sure when I got the LS40 to get the older microswitch design, which apparently you can determine how old the microswitch is if it's an older design by looking at the contacts. So they look the same as the contacts on my old LS32, so I went with that, and sure enough, they're the same. Installing it was pretty straightforward. I had soldered connectors on my arcade stick, which isn't optimal. So what I did was I noted the direction inputs and the positive, negative, and basically just spliced in quick disconnects that I already had. And after installing the stick and connecting the wiring, I just noticed that the body was a little bit larger than the LS32, so actually it hit the weight that I had in my arcade stick. I had a weight to give extra weight to the stick. I hate when the stick moves around when you're using it. So instead, what I did was I just took some rolled up coins and taped them up and sort of positioned it at the bottom of the arcade stick, and that became my new weight to sort of accommodate the larger body of the LS40. I had some concerns going into this and some warnings ahead of time. One of them was that the decreased engage distance may make inputs a little bit more dodgy, that I might get actually more unintended inputs. And another thing that I was considering ahead of time was, this kind of sounds like a minor thing, but it has a shaft cover that it comes with. I don't really like shaft covers. I use a wine glass grip. And so for me, the space between my pinky and my ring finger, I want to keep that fairly short because I use that for leverage and give a better contact. So a larger shaft, even by a millimeter or less, can alter that and make it feel quite a bit less precise for somebody like me with my arcade stick grip. So I already had an idea in mind how to handle this. I thought to just basically take off the shaft cover, but there were some problems associated with that. One is that the shaft cover at the bottom is actually necessary to the design of the stick. It is used to hold the pivot in place. So what I had to do basically is cut the shaft in 2 pieces. It actually ended up being 3 pieces because, I don't know, I ended up making a mistake, I guess, or something. But anyways, it didn't really matter too much. I had to cut 3 pieces. One is the little piece at the bottom, which still stays in the pivot. The second piece, you can see there, it just kind of comes out a little bit from the bottom of the dust cover. And the third piece rises up to just above my little height mod that I have there. So it's kind of a modular design. The reason I did this partly is because I wanted to be able to test it out. See, do I like the shaft cover, or, as I was suspecting, probably not. And so in the end, I did a lot of testing, a lot of OCD kind of stuff, and I realized, yeah, I don't like the shaft cover. It doesn't make my game any better. It actually makes it quite a bit worse. So what I did is I took another piece of a shaft cover, and I basically sanded it down a bit so it just runs about flush with the dust cover. And I've still got the height mod there, which interestingly I noticed in my testing that in order to hit the sweet spot and get a better feel, actually ended up about a millimeter less than what I'd prefer to have it with the LS32. So I hit at about 21 millimeters shaft height total from the top panel of the arcade stick. So to me, this was kind of a good thing because it shortened the throw distance even a little bit more and gave it a little more tightness. One of the pleasant surprises with the LS40 was sort of going back to the solid build quality of it, is that it just doesn't have any wobbliness. It's incredibly, I don't want to say rigid because that sounds almost like it's a bad thing, but there's just no wobble to it. Its neutral is incredibly precise, and this includes when you let go of the stick and it returns back. There is no wobble. It just sort of goes right back to center. The engage distance is particularly noticeable as being quite shorter than the LS32. And here we can see it's quite a bit of wobble to the LS32. Has a little bit of give, which I guess is good for, a little bit of forgiveness. I guess that's not a bad thing for things like fighting games, but in shmups, I think that's not really terribly useful. Although later I'll talk about this, how I learned that there is some benefit to it, but in a way it sort of isn't optimal. I'll talk about this. It was quite an ordeal going through this, what should be a small change. You start to learn about all these things that go into, basically how you play these games, and a lot more complexity than you imagine having not thought about it. One of the first tests I did after getting used to the LS40 a little bit, although it did take me a little while to get used to it, was just to sort of quantify the precision, the added precision of that shorter engage in particular. So what I did was I ran a bunch of tests where I would just do the shortest movements possible, something like 3 or 4 quick micro dodges to the left. And sure enough, after running quite a few tests and getting a decent sample size and averaging it out, I found that with the LS32, I ended up drifting a little bit farther to the left of center of the screen than I did with the LS40. But this to me just sort of visually added data to what I already knew. I could feel it when I was playing the game that things were definitely a lot more precise, and I was able to make shorter movements more consistently. So on paper, the LS40 had a lot of positive attributes that I was looking for. A shorter engage, shorter throw, faster return to neutral, and virtually no dead zone. So as I mentioned before, one of the things that I was kind of worried about was basically hitting unintended inputs because the engage distance is shorter than I'm used to. And I was prepared for this. I thought, well, if anything, I'll have to maybe level up my game a bit. But I hadn't realized how much that muscle memory I'd ingrained over all those years really made that kind of harder to shorten my movement patterns, especially in a multitude of different ways, because you're not just moving the stick with the exact same type of force and behavior with every movement. You have micro dodging, macro dodging, tap dodging, And, you know, I use these different techniques that you don't really hear people talk about a lot, but I've come to find actually it's a really big part of my game, and I came to find it through relearning how to play with this new stick. And that's what I would call jiggle, I guess. You know, not much of a technical term that I know that would cover this, but basically, I guess the most common way to do the jiggle, there's probably 3 ways that I notice I do it. One is short little quarter circle movements, like fireballs in fighting games, but really short, almost just brushing the microswitches. And another one is hitting the down diagonals, so down diagonal left and down diagonal right. Though I like to do both quarter circles and down diagonals to the left more. I'm just more comfortable doing that. And the other way is simply just to like flat out jiggle it left and right, just a little bit, hitting those microswitches just slightly in order to hopefully get your player in just the right spot that you want on the screen. This to me is a big part of my game that I've noticed, because this is a game of pixels basically, right? Where you can be a pixel off, and that's the difference between staying alive and dying. So on the LS32, I guess I must have mastered this sort of, and unconsciously I used that extra dead zone and forgiveness to my advantage to sort of jiggle it and get my player into place kind of more easily. Whereas with the LS40, I found with that short engage distance, although it made things feel a lot less laggy, because frankly, you do add lag by having that wobbliness. If you look at frames, it actually takes longer to hit the engage, which could be easily 1 frame, 2 frames of lag that you're adding right there. But because the engage is so much closer, you don't have that momentum that makes it feel more effortless and easy to back off from that you'd feel on something like LS32 that has more forgiveness, more leeway. So in that sense, you definitely have to use not only shorter movements, but also play with a lot less force. And yeah, so I've noticed that this was mostly noticeable with those little micro adjustments, those jiggling adjustments that I do. By the way, if you don't know why this works, obviously part of it is fairly easy to understand, and that's that you're just brushing the microswitches and hitting them as quickly as possible and disengaging as quickly as possible. But the other reason it works is because in most games, the diagonals make your ship go slower on the horizontal axis. Or actually, I think in a lot of games, it's the same on the vertical, but it doesn't really matter because you're usually dodging left or right. And this is called sometimes the bottom line rule of tap dodging, whereas if you're at the bottom of the screen and you're holding down and dodging, your ship moves slower. Well, it goes both ways. You don't have to actually move the ship while holding the back on the joystick. You can just tap the diagonals, or like I said, quarter circles, and you get these benefits, so your movements are even more precise. I'll probably go into this a little bit more in another video. So it's kind of funny going through this experience of switching over, because I could see right away how the LS40 was a higher precision arcade stick that would suit somebody like me, the things that I was demanding quite well. But on the other hand, the LS32 is so comfortable and so forgiving, and honestly made me feel maybe a little better than I was, because it papered over a lot of my defects, whereas the LS40, it was less forgiving, and it basically said, no, you gotta level up a little and get more precise. And at first I resisted this. I didn't want to do it, but then I thought, wait a second, there's a lot of people who use this LS40 stick. I didn't realize it, but it was the go-to stick in Neo Geo setups. So obviously a lot of people have been using this stick, and they've gotten used to it. So for me, I'm persistent. I'm just going to take that as a challenge. And I just did a lot of practicing on it. And after a bit of time, I noticed that everything I do in the game, everything seemed a little easier. But it did take a lot of time. So that's basically the main asterisk I would give about this stick. It definitely has a familiar feel if you're used to an LS32, but you will hit the wrong input. It'll take quite a bit of practice, probably, at least it did for me, until you could feel really confident and not actually hit the wrong input frequently. I've gotten to the point where I'm very confident with it, and I don't hit the wrong input very much. But actually, the honest truth is, I'm still having some learning curves with this, and the one I noticed in particular, but again, I'm taking it as a challenge to level up my game, is that when I play tense, again, that lack of forgiveness in the LS40 shows through sometimes. So you'll even see it right here, where sometimes I'll do these little movements where I'm just intending to make just short left-right movements, but I'm kind of accidentally deflecting back. So instead of just a left movement, I'll actually go quickly left-right. And that's just playing with tension, that's playing with nerves, and that's something I know I have to work on. In fact, it's probably the biggest defect in my game. So again, this is an example of where if you can overcome this, you should end up being able to perform better Because really with the LS32, I probably didn't notice my nerves quite as much because I wasn't seeing it evidenced on the screen. I was dying maybe more often, but I wasn't seeing exactly what the result was on the screen. Whereas in this case, because the joystick is a lot more precise, I'm actually seeing what the problem is, and I'm being forced to deal with it. I guess that would be what I would say about this joystick. I definitely think it is my ultimate shmup joystick, because I was already pretty close to that point with the LS32. I was getting to the point where I could feel confident playing just about any game, and the LS40 definitely now makes me even more confident. But the big asterisk is, it's only a better stick if you're willing to take the challenge and get better with it. But I guess everybody's different. Maybe somebody will feel the LS40 out of the gate immediately makes everything better, and they don't have these problems I've been having. But that's my warning in general, is that you might come across what I've come across. I've talked to a few people, and they seem to have had these issues and maybe even abandoned the LS40 because of it. I will say the LS32 definitely feels just very comfortable. It feels like it's like the oatmeal of arcade sticks. You know, it's never really bad, you know, but it's never really super amazing. It sort of just gets out of the way, you know. But because you're so used to it, you don't maybe explore better alternatives. I don't know if that's a good analogy, oatmeal. It's kind of subpar, but... Speaking of bad analogies, I was just thinking about this, that it's kind of like the LS40 to the LS32 is kind of like, you ever go ice skating and see people wearing these really, you know, particularly beginners, they'll rent these really stiff boots, you know, these plastic abominations, you know, and they'd just be these rigid skaters on stilts, kind of, you know, not really being challenged to their optimal ability, but definitely being allowed to partake in the activity of skating. Whereas when you get to a real skate, you know, like a hockey skate or something, it'll be softer, and you'll then see them maybe bend their ankles and reveal their stability and their strength issues. But there's no way around it. If you want to be at optimum, you need to challenge yourself. So that's, I think, always the trade-off with a precision or a greater precision instrument of some kind. The tendency is to want to blame the instrument, but if you take the challenge, that perceived difficulty might be exactly what you need to get over that hump of mediocrity. It was for me anyways. I'm basically just putting this caveat in there because I know everybody's different, and I'm not going to promise to you that if you get this stick, it's going to solve all your problems and it's going to make life a whole lot better. But my experience certainly was that I wanted to just go back to the LS32 and kind of forget about the LS40 at first, but then it just kept nagging in my mind. I was like, I know it makes a lot of my game better. It's just these little things that I do that I'm used to, these comfort little areas that ruined my ability to enjoy it out of the gate. So I was really persistent with it, thinking there's a way to turn this into a win all around if I just applied myself. And sure enough, that's what I found. Another thing worth mentioning is that even though I can pretty much unequivocally say that this is my ultimate shmup joystick, there are other considerations to keep in mind. I'm not always playing shmups. You know, it's my favorite genre by far, I think, but I still play sort of classic arcade games of different kinds, even modern games, and in particular fighting games. And I can't say that the LS40 so far has been that utilitarian sort of all-purpose arcade stick for all game types. I mean, I think it certainly could. With a little bit more experience with it, I could probably get just as consistent with it as I was with the LS32, with pretty much any game type. But as it stands, especially with fighting games, I noticed that the LS32, even with my improved ability with the LS40, I'm still better with the LS32 with fighting games. I don't know what it is. Actually, I'm pretty sure I know what it is. It's all those inputs, basically. And, you know, if you hit a diagonal, particularly a diagonal up, by accident in a shmup, you know, chances are you'll have some time to recover and you're off by a pixel maybe on the screen. Whereas in a fighting game, you're jumping into your opponent, you're probably going to eat a combo when all you're trying to do was just move forward, say. So I don't find that happens with me very often or anything like that, but I tested things out with the game I'm not too familiar with here, Guilty Gear, and, you know, testing air dashing and all that, just sort of messing around. I don't know, I felt like I was better on the LS32 with this. And so yeah, to me the LS32 again is sort of like that nice, comfortable, middle ground, can't disappoint you joystick. It works great with every game type. And so if you have like an all-purpose setup and you want to play a lot of different game styles, maybe the LS32 is still the best joystick you know, speaking for me anyways, for those kinds of setups. But for me, I'm kind of more modular. I can choose between these two sticks, and for my part, I'll definitely be using the LS40 first and foremost in just about any setup, and I'll only move back to the LS32 if I feel like, you know, I'd benefit from its more forgiving qualities. So anyways, I hope that explains the LS40 and how it differs from the LS32, and maybe you can use this to help find your perfect setup. Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.